Hi, is the mic on? Just testing. Perfect, thank you. Hi all, welcome to this main session of the Best Practice Forum this year. This year we have a long title. It's a Best Practice Forum on securing access to the internet and protecting core internet resources in context of conflict and crisis. Briefly introduce myself, I'm Wim Deugezelle. I work as a consultant with the IGF Secretariat, supporting this Best Practice Forum. Why am I consultant with the Secretariat? Why is the Secretariat supporting this work? Well, a Best Practice Forum is one of the modalities of the intersessional activities. It means there are a couple of topics, and this year there are 4 topics that the MAC, the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee, selects and say, well, it is important that we can work on this and we can have discussions on this, but in a broader context, not only at the IGF, but also in the weeks before, ahead, after IGF. Typically, that means a Best Practice Forum starts to work with online discussions ahead of the meeting to be able to present some outputs of the discussions at the IGF meeting. Of course, this year, everything is different. And the fact is that IGF is way earlier. That means the Best Practice Forum is really at its beginning. We have like 1 or 2 online meetings and continue to work after the IGF. I think it's very important and a great opportunity this year, because usually what happens is that we have the discussions with the team, with the core team, with people involved. At the IGF, we come to talk about it on stage, and then afterwards a lot of people are interested to join, interested to participate. And then we usually have to say, sorry, but this is the end of the cycle. Well, this year it is different. This year we can start off and we can involve everybody that's still interested in the coming months. Because our final output we only intend to, or we only will present in the 1st of November. A couple of words about the topic and the title. The topic and the objectives of the session. This session immediately comes and follows a main session that was organized last year at the IGF in Riyadh, where a panel discussed what's happening, what's important with internet access, what happens if there are conflicts, if there are crises, what it means to internet access for civilians, what it also means to the stability of the internet itself. One of the findings or outcomes of that session was exactly that there is a lot of talk, but not much is clearly defined about the topic. It is really important to have the discussion, pick up the discussion, identify roles, responsibilities, look at norms, existing norms, frameworks that might be applicable. And that is exactly where this Best Practice Forum takes off and really wants to finalize. We published a problem statement. I will come back on later in the introduction, where we invite feedback to clarify the problem, and then the panel will further discuss on this. This is also the objective of the session, is really have that input to continue to work on during the next months, to clarify the problem statement, get pointers, get feedback, get input. And also part of the discussion is to discuss what can we as a Best Practice Forum, what can we as a IGF community do in this field, what role can we play. Before I continue the introduction and go to the problem statement, I would like to invite you to listen to a video message from Mr. Abel, Director and Deputy of the High Representative Office of Disarmament Affairs of the UN. They can't be here, but they say, can we at least provide a message via video? So please let us listen.
Distinguished co-facilitators, dear participants, I am honored to deliver this message on behalf of Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. For 20 years, the Internet Governance Forum has served as an essential platform for multi-stakeholder discussions on digital public policy. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, we are reminded that our successes are underpinned by inclusive and coordinated efforts. The IGF Best Practice Forums work precisely in that spirit: open, bottom-up, collective approaches to Internet policy matters. Allow me to now turn to the specific topic at hand: the importance of securing Internet access and protecting core Internet resources in contexts of conflict and crisis situations. Safeguarding Internet resources is essential for our shared digital future. These resources include what has become known as the public core of the Internet, which constitutes the critical digital components that ensure the general availability and integrity of the Internet across borders. Assets like fiber optic cables, data centers, and satellite constellations. In peacetime, this critical infrastructure underpins digital transformation and enables sustainable development. We also see the vulnerability of these assets in conflict situations. Recent conflicts demonstrate the serious dangers posed to civilians by attacks, including through digital means, against infrastructure essential for public services and the functioning of society. We must ask ourselves, how can we mitigate the risks posed to critical infrastructure, including core Internet resources, in light of rising threats? First, international law provides clear guidance on targeting of civilian infrastructure in the context of armed conflict. Deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure are forbidden under international humanitarian law, including telecommunications and other infrastructure that help people to be informed and protected during times of war. We must always uphold these obligations and be guided by international law, including the UN Charter, in the use of digital technologies. Second, states have agreed to be guided in their use of information and communications technologies by a set of norms, including 3 pertaining specifically to the protection of critical infrastructure. Fundamentally, states have committed not to conduct or knowingly support ICT activities that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use and operation of such infrastructure providing services to the public. This includes the technical infrastructure essential to the general availability or integrity of the Internet. But responsibility rests not only with states. We must work collectively as states, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector. Efforts such as joint norm implementation and exchanges of good practice could go a long way. We must ensure that our digital future is not only peaceful, but inclusive for the benefit of all. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I think that was a statement that already has a lot of content, which the panel will definitely come back. But before handing over to the panel, and we're also going to listen to some case studies first, I already mentioned that the best practice forum developed at its first call a problem statement that we sent out for public comment or input. Maybe if I can have the slides on the screen, then, okay, thank you. Then, most important part of the slide is, of course, the QR code, where you can still provide input on the statement. So this draft problem statement, which you can see behind me, is really the starting point for the discussions of the best practice forum. It says that there is a clear and pressing need to clarify roles and responsibilities of the multi-stakeholder community and of institutions that are active within it, in securing core internet resources, and in ensuring civilian access to the internet during conflicts and crises. Like I said, we discussed that already at the first online webinar we had of the Best Practice Forum. Then we published it for input and feedback on the statement itself, but also some additional questions on norms framework, who should be involved, etc. Some of the initial feedback we received on the statement was the topic or the concept of core internet resources. It is not clear for everyone. There are different opinions, different views on what it is not. It is really important to probably not define, but be clear what is meant with it. Together and have discussions. It is important that you know what you talk about. Also, it was mentioned by one contribution that if there is ambiguity on what core internet resources is, it is very difficult when you want to operationalize norms that mention core internet or internet infrastructure. A second comment we received was that stakeholders, it is all clear, or it is a term we are very familiar with within the IGF community. Stakeholders, multi-stakeholders, who they are. It is important to name them, to be very clear, also to understand that we might have a very clear idea of who stakeholders are if you come to an IGF, but if we move outside of the IGF, other organizations that are relevant for this topic, they might have a completely different idea on who the stakeholders are. With regard to roles and responsibilities, a comment came in, we should not only look at roles and responsibilities during crisis, during a conflict, but there is also an important role, important responsibilities on what happens before, preparation for a crisis, prevention, and also what happens after crisis. If you talk about access, if you talk about securing resources, if there has been a crisis, something has to be fixed. Whose responsibility is it? And the last point that I want to mention is that it's very easy to say it's important to have access for civilians, but if you want to really have that discussion, it's important, it's crucial that you agree on what scope you want for civilian access. Like I said, there is a QR code. Please continue to provide input for this year's work. I mention it again, this Best Practice Forum now has its main session at the IGF, but we continue to work and we expect to publish a report by the 1st of November. Thank you. I now would like to hand it over to Anne-Riet, who is a co-facilitator of the Best Practice Forum and will lead the panel. The rest of the meeting, we will listen first to a couple of concrete examples, concrete case studies, and then followed by a discussion with the panel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Wim, and thanks everyone for being here. Before I introduce my panel, I want to just really stress that everyone should know this session is fundamentally different from many other sessions you've been to, in that best practice forums like national and regional IGFs and dynamic coalitions are part of the IGF's intersessional work. So in fact, what this session gives us is an opportunity to set an agenda for the work of this best practice forum for the rest of this year, and potentially, should the MAG renew it, even for a further year or two. So don't think just about what we can discuss today, think also about what we can discuss, develop and address going forward. So to take us down to sort of the more nitty-gritty of this, so we can begin to look at this problem statement, look at the work. We have with us really, I mean, every moderator says that their panels are exceptional, but to my left we have Dr. Dennis Broeders from Leiden University, who in fact is the person that first developed this notion of the public core of the internet, and he'll tell you more about that. And I don't think he knew when he did that it would actually become an ongoing process and debate, and that we're not leaving him alone as a result. And next to him is Madeleine Carr, University College London, also an academic, but these are not just your everyday academics, they're academics that are actively engaged in practice and in this space. Is a cybersecurity expert, I would say. And then we have next to her Chantal Joris from Article 19, who understands and comes very much from the perspective of international law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, which is really vital, as we also heard in the address from Adedeji earlier. And next to Chantal is Marwa Fatafta from Access Now. She leads Access Now's work in the Middle East, and she will talk to us about some of the on-the-ground experiences and what the impact is when these resources and when access is not protected. And next to Marwa, we have Pablo Hinojosa, a leader in the internet technical community for the last 20 years, who will talk to us about the part that we often don't think about, which is the institutional infrastructure that looks after the core internet resources and what happens when they are in crisis. Online to us from Palestine is Jalal Abu Kater, who is from Hamle, an organization working in Palestine, Israel, who does, I think, probably the most detailed and validated research on how social media operates and how people use and abuse social media and how the institutions that provide social media platforms operate in context of conflict. So to start us first, we're going to first look at the experience. So Jalal, really, it's good to welcome you. I'm so sorry that because of conflict that you are not able to be with us. But please tell us a little bit more about how this destruction, disruption, non-availability of access has operated and impacted in the context of Gaza.
Thank you, Henriette. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. Thank you for, of course, organizing this best practice forum. I'm hoping for an informed discussion. Of course, I'll be presenting mainly on the experience that we've been documenting in terms of what's happening in Gaza. We have been witnessing the collapse of the entire telecommunications system in real time. Since the start of the military campaign back in October 2023, the Gaza Strip has experienced repeated and deliberate blackouts, including right now. But what makes this current moment particularly alarming is the accumulated near total destruction of Gaza's internet and fixed line infrastructure. As of this week, in June in 2025, we're reporting daily on complete and partial internet and fixed line blackouts across the entire Gaza Strip. The last remaining fiber route was repeatedly targeted and destroyed by Israeli forces over the past few weeks. All redundancy in the network has been lost. Mobile networks are barely holding on, and it may collapse entirely due to the lack of fuel, infrastructure, and spare parts, of course. No repair missions are being permitted by Israeli authorities. 80% of Gaza is now classified as active combat zone, making technical intervention and repairs nearly impossible. Blackouts do have a catastrophic consequence, of course. Humanitarian organizations cannot coordinate aid. Emergency services are unreachable. Journalists are unable to report. And of course, civilians are left in the dark without the ability to communicate or receive warnings. More than 2.2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip remain digitally isolated. Of course, this is not a technical failure only. This is the use of connectivity as a weapon of war, what we refer to as digital erasure. From a norms perspective, the destruction and obstruction of telecommunications infrastructure violates the principles of both international humanitarian law and human rights law. The Geneva Conventions protect civilian infrastructure. Access to information is a recognized human right, yet there is no accountability when core internet services are deliberately dismantled, as we see in Gaza. We, of course, ask for this forum to consider how existing normative frameworks fail to protect digital lifelines in occupied or besieged territory. What happens when a state actor with control over the spectrum and an infrastructure uses that power to impose silence on a civilian population? We, of course, urge stakeholders in this space, governments, regulators, companies, multilateral bodies, to treat telecom infrastructure the same way we treat water and electricity during humanitarian crisis. We need enforceable protections for core internet infrastructure under armed conflict, as well as emergency mechanisms for civil society and humanitarian actors to deploy alternatives, whether it's by satellite, eSIMs, or portable cell networks. Lastly, I'd like to highlight that the campaign Reconnect Gaza is supported by over 60 international organizations, including some present on this panel. Of course, we are reporting on this repeatedly, and of course, we are trying to urge international action through institutions like the ITU to ensure Gaza's reconnection and future sovereignty is guaranteed. Last thing I want to say, just a couple of facts and figures. According to the World Bank, the damages to Gaza's ICT sector are estimated at $164 million, with $736 million in losses. Short-term reconstruction needs are estimated at $114 million, with total needs reaching $460 million. Without addressing these figures seriously, no humanitarian or recovery plan may succeed. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks very much, Jalal. By the way, let's not speak too quickly. We have to keep the captioners in mind as well, because they are transcribing what we are saying. I know time's limited, but thanks very much for that, Jalal. Marwa, you have been working, and Access Now works in other parts of the Middle East, including, I would like to highlight Sudan, a country which has been without internet access for years and years. So what is the experience and the impact there, in the context?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to follow up on what Jalal said and start by emphasizing on the fact that securing internet access or depriving civilian population of that is extremely different from the familiar kill switches that we know of, where an authoritarian state would just simply shut down the internet in times of unrest. We're talking about extremely complex situations, which makes our job as civil society trying to secure alternative connectivity difficult. So the connectivity disruptions that we see time and time again, and that is unfortunately a trend on the rise. Access Now runs the global coalition of Keep It On, of 300 civil society organizations working to document and stop internet shutdowns around the world. And unfortunately, armed conflict has become the leading trigger of internet shutdowns worldwide. What we see is that in times of conflict, warring parties see civilian internet infrastructure as a military target. So we see cell towers, fiber optic cables, switchboards, data centers, even ISP offices, headquarters, and even their own maintenance crews and repair crews become a target. Gaza offers, sadly, a devastating example of that in action, as Jalal outlined. Sudan is another example. For instance, the Rapid Support Forces, one of the warring parties in Sudan, they have attacked data centers and in the opposite controlled party, or in territories that are controlled by the opposite warring party, is a way to inflict collective punishment of civilians. For example, last year in February, the RSF took over internet service providers or data centers in Khartoum, which led to a complete communications blackout in the entire country. And we've seen the same pattern happening time and time again. Every time they attack data centers or seize data centers or telecommunications offices, they plunge the entire country into the dark. Another complicating factor, which I think is important for us to highlight, is we're not only talking about the destruction and the damage of the infrastructure itself, but also the warring parties weaponize access, such as banning or restricting access to repair parts, spare parts, or critical components of the infrastructure that is needed to repair it, or sometimes things are as basic as fuel, as we also see again in the context of Gaza. And therefore, simply, if you don't have electricity, you're not able to provide internet to civilians. So the basic infrastructure maintenance becomes another political and logistical battlefield between the warring parties. And these challenges are magnified even further in sanctioned context. And here I want to take Syria as a case study or as an example to mention. You know, now the Syrian regime is thankfully fallen, but after 14 years of war. And that has left half of Syria's infrastructure, including its telecommunications infrastructure, in shambles. What that meant is, for instance, it meant unreliable and slow internet. It meant fragmented internet because every territory has become reliant on ISP providers in either provided by one of the controlling warring parties. For example, in northern Syria, people relied for a long time on telecommunications and internet services provided by the Turkish authorities, which meant that during the devastating earthquake that had hit Turkey and northern Syria, the Turkish authorities shut down the internet because they wanted to control the opposition and the critical voices saying, where is the government, what is it doing to help rescue people? But it also meant that people who were relying on these networks were also were disconnected, and we're talking about a moment of extreme humanitarian needs for populations. And the question here is that, okay, you have so Syria has been one of the most sanctioned countries on earth by the US, by the EU. That also included getting in repair equipment. It's difficult for private companies, telecommunication companies, to bring in and import equipment that they need to repair and to maintain the running of this infrastructure, raising again questions about how can we secure internet access, the very topic of our discussion today, in such contexts. I want to also say that, or actually let me stop here, and I do want to raise the question of what can we do as civil society, but also as part of the IGF multi-stakeholder fora, in order to calm these very pressing challenges when it comes to internet access in armed conflict zones.
Thanks a lot for that, Marwa, and thanks for stopping. We do have limited time, but we will come back to you. Pablo, you have a very different type of disruption to discuss.
Yes, but first I would like to advocate for the continuation of the work of the Best Practice Forum next year, regardless if the IGF mandate is renewed or not. I think this is important work that needs to continue. I depart from the premise that all of us here, and I really hope it is true, if not, you are in the wrong forum, we're all in full agreement that we want to protect the public core of the internet. If not, you're really in the wrong forum. So I depart from that premise. Mm-hmm. And my argument here today is that protecting the core of the internet also includes the protection of the institutions that make it work. And I will come from the angle of resilience, because internet resilience is not about networks and cables and infrastructure, because it's also about people and organizations. And let me talk about a concrete example. It's a striking example, and this is the Afrinic case, the regional internet registry for Africa. For more than 2 years, Afrinic has endured a prolonged period of institutional uncertainty, legal proceedings, governance deadlock, leadership gaps. They all have prevented it to function as intended. And yet, through this adversity, basic services have continued. The absence of a CEO, the absence of a decision-making board has presented big challenges. And it is only thanks to the commitment of Afrinic staff, its people, that the organization has continued to provide these basic services. For that commitment, which is usually not recognized or not recognized enough, we should all be, and the internet should be, very grateful. A functional RIR is needed for internet stability because when institutions like Afrinic struggle, it's not a local issue on a single jurisdiction. If a registry cannot operate properly, it is harder to trust routing information, and it is easier for cyber attacks to happen. And that not only affects Africa, that affects the global internet. So what we've seen in this example is that weaknesses doesn't always come from infrastructure. It can also come from weak governance, legal pressures in specific jurisdictions, or the lack of multi-stakeholder community support, or enough support and pressure from the community. And I risk myself to say that when this happens, the multi-stakeholder model, the model that we have built for more than 20 years, it's not only at the IGF, but also elsewhere, to protect the internet may not be strong enough on its own. And that's the premise that I would like to put forward. And this should be a wake-up call, not just for Africa, but for all of us who care about the resilience of the internet. It challenges the long-held view that the best way to protect the internet is through non-interference. Sometimes non-interference is not enough, and inaction too can cause harm. So it's definitely time to think about positive protective measures, and I will hope that the next part of the debate will talk about it, and to help these institutions stay strong when they are under pressure. So my point is, if we want the internet to stay open, stable, and secure, if we want internet resilience, we have to support the people and the institutions that make that possible.
Thanks very much for that, Pablo. Now, we are at the Internet Governance Forum, and we do talk a lot here about norms and governance frameworks. So I'm now turning to our norms and governance experts. And just listening to this and listening to these different types of cases, some of them similar, but also different dimensions, what is your view on existing normative frameworks, soft norms, hard norms? Are they sufficient? Is it clear who they apply to, or how compliance is measured and assessed? And maybe you don't all have to comment on this, but those of you that have looked at the public core norm and the work around that, does it apply to this context? Dennis, let's start with you, then we'll go to Madeleine, and then we'll go to you, Chantal.
All right, thank you very much. So the cases are very, very different, and the normative frameworks also differ, right? So I will focus on the most global ones. And then there's three major ones that I would like to flag, some really short because others will speak to it. So there's the law of armed conflict, there's human rights law, and there's the protection of critical information infrastructure in a global sense. And that gets us to the public core. So international humanitarian law, there is always, surprises me how little protection there actually is for critical infrastructure when you really look at it. Proportionality is extremely stretchy, right? So that's one. Human rights law would be extremely relevant for the Gaza case, would be extremely relevant for the Syria case, but both of these will be addressed by Chantal, so I will leave those to the side. Third is the protection of critical internet resources and infrastructure. That's the public core. And you're right, when I wrote this more than 10 years ago under the beams in a think tank in The Hague, I did not think I would be 10 years later here still doing this, but fair enough. There has been a debate since 2015 on the idea of the public core of the internet, right? So the protection of core internet resources and infrastructure that should be exempted from unwarranted intervention by states. So in my original conceptions, I saw it as the core internet protocols and infrastructure are a global public good and should be treated as such. It is important to stress, and Pablo already did that, the public core norm is a negative norm, right? It's a thou shalt not norm, right? So they should not do it. That also means it's a political commitment, right? Implementation is really hard when it comes to negative norms, and the whole framework about sort of the implementation of norms is not necessarily helpful to the debate when it comes to negative norms. The focus is on large-scale and transnational disruption of the internet, like Pablo highlighted in the Afrinic case. So, for example, if you see how the debate developed, Gaza, for example, would not necessarily be the best fit. Human rights law would perhaps be a better way to look at it. The debate started in the Netherlands. It went to the Internet Society, to the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, of which you were a commissioner, multi-stakeholder instruments like the Paris Goal, the EU, the UN, etc. Right? A lot got translated, adapted, some things got lost in translation. That's how it works. But the central idea still is, how do we protect the integrity and the availability of the global internet, right? That's how it's formulated at the UN, also in the draft report of the Open-Ended Working Group, which came out last week. Sometimes it's policy, in the EU, for example, but mostly it's a framework. For this community, in the 2020 GGE report, was the first recognition by diplomats and states that there is such a thing as transnational critical infrastructure.
This is the group, GGE is the group of governmental experts of the first committee of the UN, so it's a fairly strong instrument.
It's the first committee, it's the security diplomats that are doing this. The fact that that the internet is a transnational infrastructure has a fairly high gehalte here, I presume, but for diplomats, this was a big thing because critical infrastructure is a national prerogative. You decide what it is, right? When I look at the protection of the core of the internet, I always look at three layers. So the technical, physical infrastructure, then the logical infrastructure, and then the organizational level, and that's where I want to end up. So if we look at the technical level, so the physical infrastructure, that is increasingly being connected to the debate of the public core, right? We see it when we talk about cable infrastructure, satellite infrastructure, etc., that is increasingly coming together. Some of that is hype, right? We had a discussion here on Monday on day 0 with some experts where they say, okay, intentional harm to these infrastructures is still fairly rare when it comes to cables, hasn't changed that much. It's real, it would have devastating consequences, it happens, but there's a lot of hype. The other thing is, for politics, for diplomacy, also to a certain extent for academia, there is a bit of a Columbus fallacy, right? It's new to us, it's not necessarily new. Others have looked at this, right? There's a lot of policy in place. They did not start yesterday just because the rest of the world discovered that this was a critical resource. So there is a lot in place already. At the logical level, you've heard ad nauseum, the protocols of the internet are not developed with security in mind, etc. Right? That's something we say to each other a lot. That makes it vulnerable, but already a lot of work has been done in the technical community also to try and fix these things. Lastly, the organizational level, and we haven't talked too much about that, but I think it's a really interesting one, and then I'll stop. If we look at Ukraine, for example, right? There's a lot of pressure on internet governance organizations to take sides. We all know the Ukrainian request to ICANN and RIPE NCC. They rejected that on the basis of neutrality, on the basis of, okay, we are caretakers of network continuity, basically. But it is also now outed as a possibility, right? The positive one on this front is that states, in the case of Ukraine, have said, okay, there's so-called internet carve-outs. The EU has said that, the G7 has said that, to not sanction these organizations in order to create continuity, but as other speakers here have already said, that does not, for example, apply to Syria, where it has happened. So that's different. The Afrinic case is also interesting, because one potential logical conclusion from what happened there is that why don't we move Afrinic from Mauritius to, say, Kenya, for example, right? That would make sense to a certain extent, but it would also mean that for the first time, we will indicate to the world that these organizations that are responsible for the key resources of the internet are a movable feast. You can put them here, you can put them there, it doesn't really matter. That will open a debate that we haven't seen yet, so that's also an interesting one. The last one that's sort of connected to that, that also means that the fact that these organizations so far have been relatively unsanctioned, they have been not really weaponized yet, is based on a tacit gentleman's agreement that is political in nature, right? So let's do a fictitious scenario. If anyone tells Donald Trump that he can turn off the internet in Iran because he has ICANN, I'm not sure what he will do. I do not have a deep faith in the gentlemanliness of the US administration at this moment. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Madeleine.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So over the course of the last year or so, we've been studying these cases, in particular the Russia-Ukraine case, where Ukraine requested that the Russian address space be shut down, the Gaza case, where the critical information infrastructure has been destroyed and there's been no, they have not been allowed to repair it, and the Afrinic case, where we saw this kind of ongoing legal, we could say, interference with that element, that organization of the public core. And we've been looking at how does the multi-stakeholder community cope with these situations of conflict and crisis. And I thought it was a very good point that Pablo made about considering these things not just simply in kind of technical or global institutional capacity, but thinking about the people and organizations that make up the maintenance of the public core. Because in fact, the reason that resonated with me is because that is a debate that happened in cybersecurity maybe 10 years ago, when we used to think of cybersecurity as a technical problem with technological solutions, and then we now realize that's just simply not the case. So I think that's a very good point to keep in mind when we consider these, because norms, of course, and international relations generally are social processes. They're about human beings and organizations. Of those three cases that we looked at, it was clear that there is a risk of interference to the public core from both state and non-state actors, and even private individuals, as demonstrated in the case of Afrinic. But it also became clear to us that there are circumstances in which these relevant non-state actors, the multi-stakeholder community, really needs to be quite significantly more proactive in protecting the public core if the multi-stakeholder internet governance model that we have worked to develop over the last 20, 30 years is to function as intended. And if it can't function as intended, then we need to be honest about that, and we need to talk about what can change. And really through these three cases, there were two big things that became apparent to us. Well, three really, but in the Ukraine-Russia case and the Israel-Palestine case, they both confronting this very concrete scenario that the norm to protect the public core in many ways emerged from, and that was this concern of states taking steps to interfere with essential internet infrastructure to the detriment of another state, or to undermine wider internet functionality. In those two cases, we saw different outcomes. So in the context of the Ukraine-Russia case, where the challenge to the public core was predominantly focused on the software, protocols, and services, we could say that the multi-stakeholder community really performed quite well. There was a there was a public conversation about the request. The responses from ICANN and RIPE NCC were very articulate, and they were publicly available. And I suppose we might say that they functioned as we would expect them to in such a situation. However, in the context of Gaza, when in a way the threat to the public core comes through the hardware, we haven't seen any real response from the multi-stakeholder community. In a sense, that community seems kind of unable to respond to such a situation, and it appears to be completely unprepared to promote the protection of the public core in a context like that. Now, there's another element to that I think that sometimes gets missed here, which is that prior to the destruction of the hardware in Gaza, the public core was already wholly dependent or significantly dependent on Israeli infrastructure. And despite agreements to the contrary, that had never been remedied by the multi-stakeholder community. So they were left in a very precarious position when this happened. And then secondly, Israel has been able to exert this kind of military force to destroy the physical telecommunications infrastructure, to prevent the repair of it, and to prevent even the private sector, when Starlink made an offer, as they had done in Ukraine, to prevent that alternative solution from being implemented. So this leaves us then with this pretty central question that we really do need to discuss in this context of crisis and conflict. Is the multi-stakeholder community either willing and or able to respond to crises like this? If it is, and it can, then how? What should happen that hasn't happened in such a context? And if it isn't able to, then who is responsible in such a situation? Because these examples have really highlighted that there is quite a significant gap here in situations like this.
Thanks very much, Madeleine. Chantal, from the perspective of international law, human rights law, humanitarian law, what is your view?
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps start by the fact that I always, when we talk about these, conflict situations, coming in as an international lawyer, I do find it challenging these days because international law is in such a massive crisis that you really feel, okay, I can tell you about the rules, but compliance is totally in existence. So maybe also by starting by saying, by protecting those institutions that protect international law, including the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, this is like a pre-requirement for being able to protect what we're talking about today as well. And obviously, questions around double standards also come up. I want to talk a bit first about international human rights law and then humanitarian law, and where I see a bit of a gap. I will not go too much into questions around extraterritorial application of international human rights law, which obviously in international armed conflicts can become a topic. Also, we've heard, for example, RSF in Sudan, the question of non-state actors, and also, again, their human rights obligations can be a bit of a tricky one. So I would just try to make a couple of concise points, but legally speaking, it's always very complex when you have these overlapping frameworks, and then you apply them to different type of actors. So under international human rights law, I would say it's reasonably straightforward in principle. Any restriction on freedom of expression and the right to share and receive information, including internet-based restriction, need to be based on the test of legality, legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality. And the Human Rights Council and others have been quite clear that when we look at blanket shutdowns, the indiscriminate and widespread effect on the population is such that they basically can never be justified under international human rights law. And this has been also explicitly confirmed, for example, by the freedom of expression mandate holders, also in contexts of armed conflict. Now, of course, in armed conflict, we also need to consider international humanitarian law, which does not provide any explicit protection of internet access, and it also does not provide any, contain any explicit prohibition on attacking internet infrastructure or restricting internet access. There are certain rules that are relevant depending on the situation. For example, we have common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which says parties need to respect international humanitarian law. So, for example, an internet shutdown specifically implemented to conceal violations of humanitarian law could be a violation of that provision. The protection of humanitarian organizations and hospitals, which is also explicit under international humanitarian law, is also contingent on them being able to access ICT infrastructure properly and operate properly. So in those aspects, we have certain protections. I want to go, and Dennis touched upon this a little bit, and it has been mentioned around these questions of the rules on attack. So humanitarian law says there's a prohibition on attacking civilian objects, the principle of distinction, and also where military objects are attacked, the proportionality needs to be considered. So there can't be excessive incidental harm to civilians or civilian objects as opposed to the direct military advantage. Here the challenge is that ICT infrastructure is often considered as so-called dual use. I think, Marwa, you mentioned that they often consider military objectives and attack it. So if it's used by both civilians and military, technically speaking, it does mean that attacking it can provide a military advantage. So under the principle of distinction, it could theoretically be allowed. What I see sometimes in commentary, particularly under international humanitarian law, what I find problematic is that it's often considered a little bit the end of the discussion. We forget that there is also, again, the proportionality requirement. And we have two challenges. On the one hand, as been mentioned, a human rights lawyer will do a very different proportionality assessment and consider civilian injury as opposed to military advantages than maybe someone working as a military advisor. So that's, it's a stretch, a concept that can be stretched. It's in the eye of the beholder in a sense. So we have different assessments of that. The second challenge is, of course, really being able to assess the knock-on effect, right? What is really the impact of an internet shutdown? Who can't call the hospital? What is the psychological impact? What are all the knock-on effects? The banking service is not being able to operate properly. Again, humanitarian organizations and so on. So that also makes that proportionality assessment a little bit more challenging. And here, I think as well, we need to work more to, so the problem is in the end you might have a situation where under human rights law, which is recognized to apply in armed conflicts, there's basically quite a clear assessment. You can't impose such a shutdown. And at the same time, under humanitarian law, maybe we have very little to limit those attacks in a specific setting. So I think we need to be more conscious of that and work more towards really a systemic integration of these two legal frameworks and consider the human rights impacts as well in a proportionality analysis and within also a proper humanitarian law response. So I think that's also something that the BPF could highlight, that there is a gap into understanding how these frameworks really interrelate.
Thanks very much, Chantal. And in fact, it's so interesting to hear this because I think you have, amongst all of you, you've outlined both the potential and the limitations of, on the one hand, the multi-stakeholder commitment to a interoperable, available, free and open internet, and also of international law. And maybe this is, where the IGF and this best practice forum comes in, is to explore whether, in fact, by looking at both and working with both together, you could perhaps fill some of the gaps and strengthen some of the weaknesses that exist in each of these dimensions, with the goal of ensuring availability, accessibility, and protection. But we don't have a lot of time left. We are going to come back, and I'm going to ask all of you, and you too, Jalal, to talk about what you would like this BPF to do, whether we should modify the problem statement. But now first I'm opening to participants. Wim, is there anyone online who has a question, who wants to make a comment? We have some people in the room. Please do participate. We really need your participation, not just today, but also remember this is an open and inclusive process. Every one of you, online and in the room, can join this work and participate in it. Shall we start over there? Milton, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Milton Mueller. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech and director of the Internet Governance Project. So I want to take up something that Pablo said and something that Madeline said. But I think part of the problem I have with the direction they went goes to Dennis's bad definition of the public core, right? So I think he got some things right. And if you're talking about the IANA registries, you're talking about the protocol level, you're talking about layer 3 and above, then you're talking about a global public core of internet resources. When you talk about physical layer, it is neither, most of the time it is neither public nor core, in the sense that all physical facilities, all cables are local in some sense, territorial, and do not, you can knock a cable out over here, it does not affect the global internet. So that is, to my mind, the answer to Madeline's question, which is, why did the multi-stakeholder community not deal with the destruction of physical infrastructure as opposed to the Ukraine situation? Well, it's because the multi-stakeholder community, by which we, I hope, mean the internet institutions, the non-state actor-based, they have no authority over the physical infrastructure. They have no authority over the ability of the Israeli military to destroy things, right? And I wish we did, but we ain't going to get that authority anytime soon. Whereas we do, and this is one of the reasons why I'm a big supporter of the internet institutions, is that we have removed the IANA registries from the control of nation states. And so that gets me to Pablo, which is like, Pablo, be careful what you wish for. You ask for positive protection for the internet institutions, like where is that going to come from? I can see, just to use a particular nation-state example, I can see the United States saying, we're going to protect the internet institutions by taking them over and incorporating them into our jurisdiction, because otherwise they might be threatened. In fact, that was the argument that was made against the IANA transition, if you recall, the congressional debates of 2016. So we got it out, we got it free. Non-interference is what you want, non-interference. Please stick to that principle.
Thanks, Milton. Just one clarification, Milton. When we talk about the internet multi-stakeholder community, we're using the IGF definition, which is everyone, private sector actors, local authorities, civil society organizations. We're not just talking about those institutions that are established as multi-stakeholder governance institutions, so we have a much broader definition. Next, please, Edmond, go ahead. Anyone online yet? No.
Edmund Chung from .Asia. A little bit picking up what Milton said, but slightly different. I guess, of course, the global multi-stakeholder community wouldn't be dealing with those issues, but the question posed earlier was whether the multi-stakeholder governance institutions can respond to some of those challenges. I think it is yes. If you look at the Ukraine situation, I think ICANN responded well. If you look at the Afrinic situation, the same threat was posed to APNIC, right? And APNIC, the multi-stakeholder model at APNIC responded well. When it was posed to Afrinic, it was a little bit, it was before this wave of challenges, and we are still stuck in that particular situation. The bigger question I think should be asked is how we build up the multi-stakeholder model to respond to these challenges. Of course, we're not talking about bombs and stuff, but the internet continuing to operate. That's what we're talking about, and I think we can. The question is how we strengthen it and build it further up.
Yeah.
Both the governance component and the operations.
Yeah. Thanks, Edmund. No other responses. I think, yes, let's hear your responses to that. And I think also Milton's question, even assuming one agrees with Milton's definition, is that good enough? Do we want to keep it that way? Is that status quo, the status quo we want to maintain, or do we need to think of adjusting it? So I think we have about 15 minutes later. Let's have a quick round of responses, and then please, let's hear more from you as well. Pablo, you go, and then Dennis.
Well, we have practiced this before, so as always, Milton, your provocation is welcome and necessary. And I think you caught the gist of the problem or the conundrum that we're facing. I was very careful not to suggest state actor interference. And something that is very clear in this discussion is that there are times that some things need to be, someone needs to come to the rescue, right? And I'm very much against the solution that is single state. I'm very much against a multilateral or intergovernmental solution, that's for sure. We agree on that. And I think we agreed on that in the work that Madeline, Dennis, and Henriette have been thinking. But I'm very much in agreement with better leadership and assertiveness and imagining solutions. And I think that is exactly the purpose of the discussion of positive measures. The solution, I don't know, but I think we have the intellectual capital. We should have the intellectual capital to say, in these cases, things have gone wrong. And what is it that we're going to do as a multi-stakeholder community and when institutions fail? Of course, you can say, do not open the Pandora box. And we have talked a lot about, should we open the Pandora box? Should we not open the Pandora box? Is this dangerous or not dangerous? And you're right to say, well, keep it closed. I'm suggesting, let's discuss.
Let's open it. Dennis.
Maybe a few points. I mean, Milton is right in the sense that the protocols are the most pure in the sense of a pure public good, right? They're not territorial in any sense. You wrote it in 2019, I wrote the same, so that's where we agree. The other thing is, when you look at infrastructure, you're right. All infrastructure in the end is somewhere within territorial sovereignty, right? That is absolutely a given. That is also why it is a norm of restraint, right? That is the reason why you formulate this in a sense, okay, that infrastructure may be on the territory of a certain state. That does not necessarily mean that in a legal sense, yes, they have jurisdiction over all that infrastructure. But we have to take into consideration that because it is a joined-up system, because it is a system of systems, if you do certain things, it will have transboundary effects, right? Is it within every country's legal remit to do things that have transboundary effects? Strictly speaking, yes. But there's also due diligence obligations. I know Americans are not fond of due diligence obligations, but they are there. There's also ideas of transboundary harm. There's also ideas of do no harm principles. For example, I use the example more often. If you look at rivers, right? Nobody disputes that the river Rhine goes through Germany and it comes to the Netherlands, etc., right? So there is territorial jurisdiction. However, if you dump something in Germany, it's going to end up in the Netherlands. So there is an idea that, okay, maybe it's not just within territorial sovereignty, there's transboundary effects, and the internet sort of has a certain flow in that sense as well, right? So that's what I would like, and that's one of the reasons why we talk about a norm of restraint. The last thing is to say, okay, if you move these things to a multilateral institution, you get a different governance. I totally agree. But they are already in a jurisdiction now, right? Afrinic is in the jurisdiction of Mauritius. That has consequences. ICANN is in the jurisdiction of the United States. That has consequences. So it's not like they're outside of jurisdiction at the organizational level. The protocols, yes, they are not territorial in any sense, but the organizations, in the end, are also within a jurisdiction. There's no way around it. There will always be a jurisdiction.
Any other questions from the floor? Or I think then let's now go back to our panel, and if anybody in the room wants to make a suggestion. Oh, there is someone there. Please, we have a voice from Norway. I'm very happy to hear that. Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Julian Sildenanglo, Norwegian guy. I am in the private sector and also a ham radio operator and a software engineer. So this is more of a technical thing than a policy thing, but I think what would help a lot in emergency situations and actively disrupted areas is if there was more policy towards enforcing mesh technologies into phones, like having phones be able to talk to each other, and then if one of them has access to the internet, send low bandwidth information, because you don't really need, in an emergency situation, much more than text. Like, you need to be able to send to one person, hey, I'm healthy, I'm not, but just for emergency usage.
Thanks very, very much for that. So to the panel, to everyone, and maybe we can start with Pablo, and then we'll go on to and end with you, Jalal. Listening to this, and based on the problem statement, the feedback that we've had on the problem statement, what would you like to see? What do you think will be useful work for this best practice forum to do, to explore, to develop, to research, to bring people together around going forward? Pablo.
Well, I think the current report triggered this discussion, and this discussion has a lot of questions to answer. So I'm in favor to continue to work on these questions. I'm also conscious about what Milton says. I mean, opening the Pandora's box, particularly in an environment that, as our colleague said, is not very much in favor of rule-based or international cooperation or things like that. I mean, is this the right time or it's not the right time? I'm conscious about it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried. and that's, I guess, the work that is happening, whether we can have some more imagination.
And Pablo, just a quick follow-up question. You've been working with the Marconi Society on exploring internet resilience as a concept and as a process. Do you see this work as being relevant to or overlapping in some way with the notion of internet resilience?
Entirely, and I really would love you to refer to the video of yesterday's conversation, because it has a huge intersection in terms of what could go wrong and how can we take preventative measures and risk mitigation issues, and who is responsible to fund and invest on those preventative issues that allow us to have a resilience mindset. And this is, again, not only in the infrastructure, which is privately owned and difficult to regulate, but still has a lot of interdependencies. And we have to cover for those interdependencies one way or another. And that's kind of the work that we're doing in the Marconi Society by triggering this discussion, as we did yesterday. 139 is the keyword. Just look for it and watch the video.
Thanks, Pablo. Marwa, do you have suggestions?
I do, and I want to bring the conversation back to the people. People on the ground who are impacted by shutdowns. And actually, as we speak, Palestinian telecommunications companies has warned that they are going to face yet another complete blackout because they are simply running out of fuel. So my question is here, and that's the question that also communities ask us as civil society: how can we get connected to the internet? We need it. It's a lifeline. It's a life-saving tool. And here, unfortunately, of course, we can advocate And we can issue public letters and statements that go into this wild universe. We don't know even who's reading them, saying this is a warning sign, we need to act together. We can, again, time and time again, highlight the detrimental impact of internet shutdowns and how they violate IHL, how they violate human rights. But we can, in some cases, also provide eSIM cards, foreign SIM cards, cross-border connectivity, but those often are unsustainable solutions, and they tend to come to small pockets of individuals, such as journalists and human rights defenders. Engaging with the UN telecommunications or emergency telecommunications cluster, they do vital and important work, but their mission is restricted to providing connectivity to humanitarian actors and not to the wider population. So the question here is, and then again, in some cases, communities are really find themselves, such as in the case of Sudan, having to rely on Starlink. Because they say, okay, we know it's creating new private monopolistic dependencies, which expose already vulnerable populations to further vulnerabilities, because again, we are dependent on the whims of one tech billionaire who can, as in the case of Gaza, thank you, Madeleine, for sharing that, who said, I am not going to provide Starlink to the population in Gaza, because the Israeli Minister of Communications tweeted, don't you dare. And he also threatened to withdraw Starlink from Sudan, even though it wasn't licensed then, and from Ukraine. So that's also not an alternative solution to us. What I think we really need right now is a multi-stakeholder mechanism where we can go to states, technical community, private actors, private telecommunications companies, and civil society to say, there is a crisis in X country, we need funding, we need political leverage sometimes on political or on warring parties to let repair equipment in. And also, finally, I also totally agree with the point you raised, Pablo, and that's something I have been thinking quite a lot about in the context of Gaza and Syria, is that we need to also think beyond this rapid response or emergency response, because armed conflict is very cyclical in nature. Armed conflicts are becoming increasingly intractable, thank you. And they're having an open-ended nature, which means that when we're talking about the collapse and the disintegration of telecommunications at an infrastructural level, how can we ensure that such a mechanism can provide the rebuilding of resilient and independent infrastructure? In the context of Gaza, some telecommunications companies from previous rounds of war, I'm sorry, just to wrap up, said, okay, we're going to run out of fuel, so we will have emergency batteries. They never expected that there will be an unfolding genocide for a year and a half. So these are some examples where we can think at a technical level, how can we build resilient solutions to prevent and to help communities get connected once internet becomes a weapon of war.
Thanks, Marwa. And that's an excellent, concrete, multi-stakeholder solution we can explore. Chantal, you've got less than a minute each. Sorry.
I will have 20 seconds. Yeah, I think also, again, establishing the missing link between the different communities. I've been talking about internet shutdowns for a long time. I've, never been on the same panel as you, who look at it from a very different perspective, and I think it's incomplete if we don't have this conversation. And also, plus one to what Marwa said, I think also the role of corporate power is an extremely important element in all of this that should also be considered as we move forward, and I will pass on.
Thanks. Madeleine?
I'll be super quick because I want to leave time for Jalal. I would just say of my hopes for this in the future is that we can please continue to have difficult conversations and not avoid things that make us uncomfortable. Because I think in the internet governance community, there has been a lot of stuff that's been off the table and somehow sacrosanct for too long. And I don't think that's helpful. I think we need to be able to get together at places like this and talk about the things that are uncomfortable or confronting.
Thanks, Madeleine.
I'll try to be as quick as possible. So yes, be careful what you wish for, but that also sort of supposes that the world hasn't changed, and it has, right? It's a different geopolitical world. It's also a different world in terms of multi-stakeholder community, right? We now have more cables, more redundancy, yay, but we have less companies that actually do the cables. What does that mean for multi-stakeholderism, right? If one of the companies If one of those people is gaining in power, companies wading into the Ukraine conflict without being asked, companies doing certain things or not doing certain things because they're asked by governments. It is a different world out there, and that has an impact on how we can look at these things and what we can and cannot do.
Thanks, Jalal. And Jalal, you are with us, actually, almost not with us as a result of what we are talking about. So what would you like us to do?
Indeed. Thanks for this conversation. I want to stress on my colleagues and on the panel, the points made are points I support. Of course, there are gaps when we're doing this proposal. Like, enforceable norms are lacking. There is no emergency protocols for protecting this essential digital infrastructure. And of course, we're seeing connectivity being weaponized, not just disrupted unintentionally. So there has to be consideration for how can we empower other actors, like local actors, civil society, technically and diplomatically, to respond to the blackouts and explore emergency connectivity pathways, satellite or community networks to see how they can be deployed in such situations when access is denied. And of course, the point of my fellow colleagues, I'm supporting them, and thanks for the time.
Thanks very much, Jalal. Our time is up, and I'm sorry we couldn't give the floor to everyone. We will have an online webinar. I think, Wim, it will be in the first half of July, where we are going to continue this discussion. We'll invite other IGF workshops, because actually some dealt with undersea cables, some dealt with resilience, some dealt with conflict and human rights. We'll bring them together, and we will then consolidate all the feedback and input and develop the agenda. So anyone who wants to join this BPF, Wim, just stand up so they can see you. Wim, who opened the session for us. I think Valeria is there as well from APC. Please just drop your email or find out how you can join. Thank you very much, everyone. I think it was extremely rich. I think we got a lot. Thanks.
So there.